All right, let's go ahead and get started with our notes today. I encourage you to take out a sheet of notebook paper and line just left of center. We're going to talk about three main concepts today. The first one is the white man's burden. You may want to add that as point number 1 on the left-hand side, white man's burden. Then we're going to talk a little bit about colonialism and imperialism. So I want you to jot down a few notes on each of those concepts. Again, that's white man's burden, colonialism, and imperialism. These notes and what I'm going to share with you up on the board are actually linked on the website. If you go down to Africa, and then underneath our links where we have all the different sections of the map that you guys are supposed to be looking at, preparing for our map quiz tomorrow. Underneath it, it says the white man's burden. Does everybody see that link? Right there. You click on that, and it opens up our document for us to be using today. We're going to start. There's a lot of stuff underneath it. We're going to start with this, though. A political cartoon. I like political cartoons because we can learn so much about a concept. It creates depth for it, helps us make connections. A lot of times by looking at and analyzing a political cartoon, we can figure stuff out about it, that concept, without even having it to be taught to us. Okay? So this political cartoon has been defined or termed, titled, The White Man's Burden. I want you to discuss with your partner for just a second what is going on here, right? What is the white man's burden? How does this picture depict the white man's burden? A couple things that students earlier today asked. There's some words here, and you can't really see it being far away, so I'll read them to you. The words on these boulders, it's superstition, oppression, ignorance, vice, brutality. Over here is barbarism. Up here, it's kind of the same thing, slavery, vice, right? Ignorance again. But eventually up here at the top, it says civilization. Civilization at the top. Go ahead and describe or discuss this between you and your partner. Describe what is going on here. What's being depicted here? Okay, so that's fine.
People. Is it possible white people?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe
All right, let's go ahead and discuss this a little bit. Actually, let's start with Miss Barnes' question there. I thought that was kind of insightful. Miss Barnes asked, can white people be slaves, right?
Well, it's because, usually, if we're, going back, usually the typical,
The assumption is that slaves are of a darker skin color.
But that's what everyone's always been told.
Right, exactly. So that's us as students of American history, that's what we think of. That's what comes to mind first. We'll read race in the springtime, and we'll go back to, ancient Roman times, right? And talk about slavery in that particular context. In that context, no, slaves aren't white. Slaves aren't of a darker skin color. They are white in that context. Okay? So, how does that apply to this? Okay? The question kind of interposes the idea that these guys are being enslaved, and they're having to carry the weight and do for others. That would include these people up here that are in the baskets, right? They're doing all the work and they're carrying the load. Sound good? So that gives us a good start, a good foundation to think about with this idea of the white man's burden. Something else, Ms. Barnes.
So like how we were just saying, because if those people didn't have enough money, so they had to find a low income job. So it's was that why they become slaves?
It could be, A lot of times it's debt slavery, right? That could happen in any context. It did happen in the Roman time period as well. A lot of times it's because you're a prisoner of war. You know, prisoner of war, you're enslaved as a result of your defeat on the battlefield. Going back to this though, what do we see? What did you guys come up with? Miss Scott.
They're carrying uncivilized people.
They're carrying the uncivilized people to civilization. Okay, that's good. Anything else that jumped out at you? Did we identify the characters that are in the image? Do we make connections? Tyler? They got Uncle Sam here, right? So Uncle Sam represents who? Yeah, Tyler. The American people, the American culture. Okay, does anybody identify who this fancy fellow is? It's fancy. Yeah, Miss Bloomer?
Britain?
Yeah, it represents the British culture, right? English culture here, okay? Did anybody identify who these people are? Some of them, if you pull it up on your Chromebook, you actually see that they're labeled. Tyler?
Are they supposed to be like other countries from like Africa?
Yeah, they are, right? So, you got indigenous peoples from Africa. You got some of the indigenous populations from Asia over here. You've got Amerindians in the mix, right? Here as well. You got Indian here as well. And some of them, like I said, they're labeled. Here's Cuba. This one says actually Cuba on it, okay? Ms. Barnes, something else to add?
It's a question. So what, like, are they talking about, so like from those places, like people that are like getting carried, like not from the low income like spots in their country?
Uh-huh.
So like that's why they're being carried, because they can like basically.
I'm going to rephrase your question here, alright? So, the idea with white man's burden, there's two concepts, and it kind of goes with this idea of civilization, okay? Who is civilized in this group here? Are the people in the basket civilized, or are the people carrying them civilized? And who's uncivilized? Are the people in the baskets uncivilized, or is the people that are carrying them are uncivilized? Which one is which, Tyler?
Wouldn't they both be civil in their own culture?
The goal is that both of them eventually are going to reach civilization. But, you know, you are kind of right. But according to our ethnocentric tendencies, right, from their perspective, one is civilized and one is not. Yeah. In that, did everybody hear what he said? It's kind of insightful. In their own culture, each one would be considered civilized, right? But because of ethnocentrism, it's not exactly the case from certain perspectives. So which ones are civilized? Mr. Folks? Which one? The people carrying them. Okay? Then the uncivilized would be the people in the baskets. Okay? Go ahead and write this definition down for white man's burden. White man's burden, we really have two definitions to consider. The first one is what the American, what the British individual would like you to think of the white man's burden. It's the responsibility to civilize the uncivilized. That's what the white man's burden is. The responsibility to civilize the uncivilized. Okay? So the way that this is depicted here is this responsibility. Is that like a burden or is it like a joy? The way it's depicted here. Is it a burden or is it a joy?
Burden.
It's a burden. Right? You may want to write responsibility, put burden in quotation marks or in parentheses next to it. Okay? It's the idea that they don't really want to do it, but they're willing to do it, right? Because they feel obligated. They're born into the Western world, and life is so much better there than everywhere else, right? The norms, the way that they do things is just, obviously right. And then all these indigenous populations around the world, they just haven't had the opportunity to be exposed to the right way of doing things. So we've got this burden imposed upon ourselves. To go out and to help them out, to civilize them, okay? All right, definition number 2. What's really going on when you separate yourself from this perspective? It is justification for bad behavior. Justification for bad behavior is the second definition that we use. Or justification for exploitation. Sometimes I use that terminology because it kind of rhymes. Justification for exploitation. Justification for exploitation. Because there's some stuff that goes on during this process of civilizing the uncivilized. that benefits the colonizer, the white man, or those a part of the Western culture. Okay? The white man's burden, it's actually a poem. It's an idea, but it's actually a poem written by this guy, Rudyard Kipling. You guys remember referencing the other day that I wanted to name my first son Rudyard, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to this guy. He's the guy that wrote the children's books of Ricky Tikki Tavi and the Jungle Book, right? That guy that you're familiar with. So those are really good children's stories. You know, they're kind of interesting. But the reality is, those characters are symbolic of other political figures or cultures, is what they are. It's really more complex than a children's story. Okay? So he wrote some other things, and one of them was The White Man's Burden. And it's a poem, and this is just a small excerpt of it. And I want to go through it and dissect it in just a moment. It says, take up the white man's burden, right? The responsibility to civilize the uncivilized. Send forth the best ye breed. Send forth the best of your young people, right? And what we're going to do is with those young people, we're going to send them outside of the Western world to these indigenous native populations around the world, right? We're going to take our best and put them out there, and they are examples for others to follow, okay? For them to acquire the norms of our culture. Go bind your sons to exile out there to serve your captives' needs. To wait on heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen people's half-devil, half-child. Who's he describing as half-devil, half-child here? Who is half-devil, half-child? Who is half-devil, half-child, Tyler? The Americans, good try. From the British imperialists, from the American imperialists, the perspective is everybody that's in a basket. The uncivilized. Alright? Now again, think about the time period, the context here. It's 1865 to 1936. So this is 19th, early 20th century mentality. Sound good?
Yes.
Alright? So this is not necessarily something that's right now. Okay? So it's describing those other people that are out there that they say they need a little bit of help from their perspective. Okay? Now, a couple things. Rudyard Kipling, he's an Indian-born British writer. So what does that mean? He's from the British culture, right? He's British, but he was born here in India. India was once a British colony. What does that mean? It means that it was under British imperial rule. So the British politicians, they're over here governing this area. Why would you do that? Does anybody got any ideas of why the British would at one time govern, control India? Just folks?
Expand their power.
Yep, expand their power. Right? Let's go back farther. Age of exploration. You got all these Western Europeans, right? They start sailing around the world. Where are they trying to get to? What's the destination that they want to get at? They want to get someplace because they got spices and goods and stuff like this that the Europeans never.
China?
It's China. They want to get over here. Southeast Asia. Okay? So what do? They start, a lot of them sailing around Africa to get there. Okay? Others start sailing this direction and they run into a whole mess of stuff over here. Okay? So in that process, on the Age of Exploration, they start to figure out that there are a lot of people out there in the world that are not exactly like them. Right? The indigenous populations. Okay? And they also, in the attempt to get here, they start making pit stops and rest stops along the way, okay? Because it's a long trip. Like you going down the interstate. You ever stopped at a rest stop before? Right? You do that to rest, right? To recharge. So down in South Africa, there was an organization called the Dutch East India Company. They were in charge of sailing all the way here and getting all these goods and then bringing them back to Europe. They set up a colony down here in South Africa. And once they were there for quite a few years, they happened to come across all these diamonds that were down here as well. So they started expanding this colony. And so they really took control over this entire area. And then it started to expand farther and farther north, right? So when they did this, they set up these diamond mines. Did they redistribute the money that came from the diamond mines to the indigenous population? Who got all the money? The Dutch East India Company, right? The Europeans back here. So that's really the beginning of colonialism and imperialism. you set up colonies, like over in India, they grew a particular crop that was big in the textile factory. What would that be? Cotton, right? They put the indigenous population, the native-born people, to work. They exploit the labor. They produce a product. Who gets all the money? They do, right? So they get really rich and wealthy as a result of that, okay? So, half-devil, half-child refers to the indigenous native-born populations, okay? So that's why he was born in India, right? Now, two other terms that you need to know of, colonialism and imperialism. Colonialism is the process to establish colonies by a mother country. That would be Great Britain. Other European countries did the same, right? French did it, and the Germans did Dutch, right? The United States eventually got involved in this at the beginning of the 20th century. Reading a book with Preston right now. It's about Teddy Roosevelt, right? Teddy Roosevelt, really kind of a big imperialist. We say a lot of good things about him, right? Imperialism was, got a lot of good things for the United States as a result of it. However, there are some exploitation going along with it, okay? So, by a mother country in another part of the world, right? So, if you really think about Great Britain, India was once a colony there. The United States was once a colony of Great Britain. South Africa, a colony of Great Britain. Australia, a colony of Great Britain. These things are all over the place. Sound good? They had a lot of colonies. Economic exploitation, a big part of colonialism. Going beyond colonialism, what is imperialism? The process of building up a large world empire. So colonialism is a key component of imperialism. They are closely related, but there is a key difference, okay? So colonialism is really a process that's a part of imperialism there. Sound good? And so through this process, of colonializing or establishing colonies throughout the rest of the world, in a way, they realized that they're kind of taking advantage of the indigenous population. So they had to come up with some type of justification for what they were doing, because essentially they were enslaving the indigenous populations around the world. And if you are enslaving somebody, taking away their rights from them, you kind of feel bad for what you're doing. So you got to do something to justify it. So how do you justify it? In a way, they came up with the concept of the white man's burden. We're civilizing them. We're bringing culture to them, right? We're not enslaving them. We're bringing culture to them to make their lives better, right? It's justification for exploitation. Sound good? Has everybody got a better understanding? So when we say white man, it's not necessarily pertaining to race as it is the Western world is what that particular terminology is for, is referencing there. Sound good? Questions before we shut it down for today? No? All right. You got just a moment. I do want to remind you, map quiz tomorrow. Map quiz tomorrow.